What's up, everybody? We're happy to be back. We've been having a good time with these studies in Romans. Up, we're going to restart the recording here.
I
Oh,
heard
actually,
Andy
we
was
should we
saying,
should keep this in the recording. Actually, just keep it
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, when people can have the Kyle Fisher sighting,
Yeah,
like this is gonna have the most views for
yeah,
sure.
exactly.
Katie came and said, Andy's on the phone. And I'm like, no way. So you used to say hi. Good to see you,
Good to
Andy.
see you. Yeah, you look great.
Not as good as Ben, but
We're
we're going
trying
to aspire to
the
it.
African
Especially
glow.
with the gray hair.
Yeah, we call it the African glow. So, there you go. Special guest cameo appearance here. So we've gotten through about half of Romans chapter 1, where Paul is introduced really his subject, which is the gospel, and his urgency and his desire to preach the gospel, including in Rome. And then last time he kind of gave sort of a summing up, closing statement of his introduction of the gospel, where, if I remember, I think we got all the way through verse 17, where he says, "Hey, I really, really want to preach the gospel because I'm not ashamed of it because it's the power of God for salvation." And the reason why it's the power of God for salvation is because it reveals the righteousness of God. And I want everybody to know about that. But then we're kind of, I think at that point, we're kind of like, okay, but why is that so important for everybody to know? And that's kind of where he's going to go for the next couple chapters, is to help us see, hey, we need that righteousness of God that's revealed in the gospel. And that's kind of where we're going next. What else should we say to kind of set up the rest of chapter 1 here and where we're going?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think that what we're about to read is kind of the beginning of one of his arguments in the book that's going to last for a couple of chapters. But I sometimes think of like verse 18 as moving through chapter 3. The Gentiles are sinners, the Jews are sinners, everybody's a sinner, and that's true. But I think it's also maybe connected to verse 17 when he says at the end, he quotes Habakkuk, the righteous man shall live by faith. The rest of that verse in Habakkuk is, behold, the proud one, his
Mhm.
heart is not right in him, but the righteous will live by faith. And there's a contrast being made in Habakkuk to the darkness of the world and the sins that Habakkuk's like crying out about, and why aren't you doing anything about this? And then even who's God is using in Habakkuk to bring the wrath against his people. I think in some ways this still is contextually linked to, hey, how are we going to live through the darkness of a world like this? We've all been a part of it, but are we going to escape it? Is there any way to live through it? So anyway, I might just set that up and say, don't forget the Habakkuk quote in this. So
That's great. I hadn't really thought about that second part of the verse. That's awesome. And just a good reminder, like a lot, I think this will probably come up one or two more times, or maybe five or six more times in Romans. But when sometimes it seems like Paul just quotes a thing just because, like, hey, this just fits with what I'm saying. But sometimes
right.
he's quoting a thing saying, like, hey, go back and read that, and you'll kind of be more ready for what I'm about to say. Or like, I'm going to give you sort of a fuller interpretation of that thing back in whichever prophet or from the writings of Moses or whatever. And that's a great point. All right, cool. So we'll just read the rest of chapter 1 and then see what we can get from it. Romans 1, starting verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so that they're without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasonings, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, of birds, four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore, God gave them up to vile impurity in the lust of their hearts, so their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for falsehood, and they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for that which is contrary to nature. And likewise, the men too abandoned natural relations with women and burned in their desire toward one another. males with males committing shameful acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper. People having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them.
Heavy, heavy, heavy.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder when I read something like this, Paul's writing to Rome, Christians in Rome, they're in the shadow of the White House basically. And a lot of the behaviors and lifestyle things that he talks about in this literally would have been lived out by their leaders, you
Mhm.
know. Um, and I know we live in a time where as things are maybe exposed, and I think deep down we all know that even people in powerful positions are sinners and do terrible things just like everybody can do terrible things. But, we seem so shocked by some of the things that are revealed. I think they lived in a time where it might not even have been that shocking for everybody. It was sort of just in your face, right out in front. Um, but so was Paul writing about Rome, the culture of Rome? Was Paul commenting on all cultures throughout history that were Gentile cultures that didn't have God? I don't really know the answer to that. But I do kind of have this question. Has anybody ever lived really in a time where these kinds of sins didn't exist? You know, and maybe there's a yes to that. Maybe there were periods of time where certain groups of people, nations, maybe even God's people in the Old Testament, you wouldn't see some of these things, very much or very often. Or maybe there's pockets in the world where people are more focused on serving God or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, like, the world's always struggled with these things, no matter where people live.
Yeah. This is a different part of scripture, but it's kind of a similar idea that I think maybe this helps with. But I think about that whenever I read the book of Revelation, like every time. So like you read Revelation 13, for instance, the beast. And like everybody's always like, oh, what's the beast? Like it's probably every new
Right.
president, he's the beast. Like, whatever, like right now, there's got to be tons of like Iran and China and Russia and stuff about the beast. And I imagine Christians over there have to be. Christians in Iran are like, oh, the beast, it might be the United States,
Right.
because, and I guess my point is like, just depending on where you are, um, geographically and where you are historically, you see those things pop up in all kinds of different ways, um, all throughout the world. And that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I think to your point, for sure, it was a really special way in Rome. But I don't know, whenever this letter found its way to China or to, Zulu territory of Africa or whatever, people were like, oh yeah, I know exactly what that looks like. And here's how
Right.
it's looked in my culture, in my world, whatever the case may be.
And that helps explain why throughout human history, you know, even after Jesus, it seems like almost every generation of Christians thinks, "Oh, the end of the world's about to happen." You know what I
Right.
mean? If you look at all the predictions that have been made, if you read all the writings of people, it seems like any generation, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, everybody's like, "Man, it's about to happen. Jesus is about to come back." Because when you're looking at the sins in the world, you realize, well, God may be ready to do something about this finally.
Mhm.
But this is actually one of my favorite parts about this text. And I don't know, it took me a long time to finally realize it. But in verse 18, when it says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against ungodliness and unrighteousness. We could read that like someday the wrath of God is going to be revealed against this. We could read it that way. And I think when we get to chapter 2, verse 5, he does talk about storing up wrath for yourself in the revelation of the righteous judgment of God. So like there is some time coming where there's going to be a judgment and the wrath of God. But the language here seems to be current.
Mhm.
Like I think even some of the versions say the wrath of God is being revealed. Isn't that right? Like the New King James or some of them I think say
It may
the
be.
wrath of God is being revealed. Like it's something that's already happening. But
Mhm.
then if you read the way Paul describes this, he seems to be saying one of the ways that God actively reveals his wrath is by giving people over to the consequences of what they're doing. But this has been a brain shift for me. Like it used to be like, I'd sit around and watch all the things that are going on in the world and wring my hands and be like, man, when is God going to do something about this?
When is he going to reveal his wrath?
When is he going to when is he going to judge and fix this? Or
Mhm.
when's he going to? But the way I read this text now is I actually see God working
Mhm.
here. And the way you can see him working is actually when people are turned over to these lusts and they even do things that you're like, that's shocking that they would be so unnatural with their own bodies or, you know, behave in ways that were so counter to nature or to the reality. What's happening? Well, according to Paul, what's happening is the wrath of God's being revealed. God's actually active in trying to do something by being passive or patient. But there's levels of the wrath being revealed. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
I totally agree. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know if this, I may be going off a little bit of what you're saying, but the way I would kind of summarize some of that is um, when you're living in sin, you're living under wrath. You're living in the condition of the wrath of God. Like all the things you're experiencing, all the things that you're choosing to do, the way your life is shaping up, whenever you're turning away from God, that's the experience of the wrath of God that you're going through, which I kind of think about. We talked about this a little bit last time about just some of Paul's love for others, love for the barbarians and the Greeks and all that kind of stuff. Whenever we look around at the world, we should be deeply disturbed. We should look forward to Jesus putting everything right. We also should look with a real sense of compassion and concern for people that all the bad stuff they're doing, they're under the wrath of God. Like they're experiencing that condition of life. They're not experiencing life in the grace of God and all the goodness and the flourishing that comes from that. God has given us up and we've been rescued from that, but everybody in sin has been given up, given over to all this really bad stuff that he describes here in this chapter.
Yeah. And what you just said too, like when we look at it and we need to like have some amount of compassion, I actually believe that God doing things this way is him also showing compassion.
Yeah.
Whether you do this on like a national level, like Paul might be describing a whole culture, or like you just said, in somebody's individual life. Like I choose to not be thankful to God anymore. I choose to not honor him as God anymore. I choose to, you know, worship the creation rather than the creator. I become the focus instead of God and other things. In my own individual life, if God gives me over to certain passions and things, and I begin to suffer in my own body the due penalty of my error, what's God trying to accomplish? He's not trying to destroy me in that.
Right.
He's trying to wake me up. He's trying to like maybe let the darkness get so dark that I hope for light and I realize something needs to change. Or like later, Paul's going to make kind of an argument that realizing and feeling that is going to make me know I need a savior, like almost a teacher to bring me to Christ. Um, and so maybe that's the way God works. I think that plays out in the way that God's always shown himself to work in nations or with the Jewish people in the Old Testament. But God's not, he's actually working. I've learned to say this to people, by the way, when they're living in a difficult, sinful sort of lifestyle and they start suffering because of their sin, and they'll say something like, "Man, God's totally just forgotten about me. God's forgotten about me. He's like he doesn't care about me anymore." Like all of that. I try to say like, well, either that or think about this passage. He's actually trying to get your attention. He could have rubbed you out a long time ago. He could destroy a place whenever he wants or destroy your life, but he's kind of letting you feel things that are the consequences of your life, actively showing you his wrath so that maybe your soul can be saved at the end,
Hmm.
which is how Paul's going to write to the Corinthians later about how to deal with a brother who won't repent. Deliver him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. Maybe that'll work. Like the wrath of God in that way will bring somebody back. I don't know.
And I think he kind of circles back to this in chapter 8 in this book, where that great chapter about like new life and hope and
Yes.
the love of God and all this stuff. But in the middle of that, he talks about all the sufferings in this world that exist. And this in this context is more about people suffering even when they're going through righteousness. But in verse 20, it says, "For the creation was subjected to futility."
Hmm.
That's what he says right here. I think is it verse chapter 1, verse 21. They became futile in their understanding. So, okay, the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. In other words, God did all this stuff we're talking about in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So I just think like he's going to circle back to the same notion we're talking about, which is God's trying to wake you up. God hates like all the ungodliness and unrighteousness, all the destructive stuff that we know is destructive. Some of these things in this list in chapter 1, we all have kind of our little, fleshly affinities of like, well, that's kind of my sin. It's not that bad. But the list as a whole, almost all this stuff, everybody would agree, like, "Ugh, it's not a very cool thing. Like even if I have to do it, it's not a very good thing to do or whatever." And we see the destructive nature of these things. Honestly, even if you're not a Christian, a lot of these things, at least, you see the destructive nature of a lot of this list. And certainly, if you're somebody who, believes in God, believes in the Bible, then you're going to look at this list and you're like, yeah, it's pretty bad stuff, all of it. And that's why God hates it, is because it destroys us. I mean, this list kind of is the outline of the world from Genesis 1 through 11. I mean, so many of these things pop up, repeatedly, not to mention later on it happens in the history of Israel. And then, like you were saying earlier, in the culture in Rome and every culture and all that. But you can go back and read the first few chapters of Genesis and you're like, oof, it's pretty bad out here with these people who have turned away from the knowledge of God, turned away from caring about Him. And God's kind of at the center of that. Like, God's the one. It wasn't just like Adam and Eve ate the fruit and then boom, automatically the world got cursed. God cursed the world. God brought this consequence and on and on and on. Cain. And then you come to the days of Noah and the Tower of Babel and all these things. God did these things, just like you said, to try to get people's attention. And He's still trying to do that with all of us.
Yeah. No, that's really good. This first part of the text that we read, when Paul makes statements like, you know, what is known about God, verse 19, which is known about God is evident, my version says within them.
Yeah.
Um, I think, but notes say like among them.
Hmm.
And then he points to the creation in verse 20, and that things are clearly seen in the creation. Is this what he's getting at? Like people should be able to look at the things around them and see something about God, like Psalm 19 would say. The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows his handiwork. But is the among them or within them also like when David would say, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made? Like anybody who gives any amount of thought to like their own, not just the system of the creation, but the system of their own body, well, like, how do you not walk away from this thinking like this is a miracle? Life is a miracle. Like, how is a baby formed in the womb? Like, how does how does God do what He does? With this shocking statement at the end of verse 20, they're without excuse. I mean, you've now lived a couple of different places, right? Like from Alabama to New York to Atlanta to Africa, and people are just people who still see the same things no matter where you live. And Paul says at some point when they talk to God, they're not going to have any excuse to say that they couldn't have known there was a creator who was powerful and majestic in some way.
Yeah. And that there's some kind of moral rightness and wrongness.
Yeah.
And of course, like all of human history and philosophy and religion and all that is us trying to piece out, trying to figure out ourselves what is right and wrong. But we all kind of know there is such a thing as right and wrong. And that may be one of those, he talks about eternal power. I see that whenever I look up, at the stars and all that kind of stuff. Just side note, man, one really cool thing. Have I told you about the stars here since we live on the equator?
Oh, is it super bright?
No, not well, in some places, yes, but like where we are, there's a lot of light stuff that kind of mess up. But you can still see some stars. But you can see northern hemisphere stars, constellations, and southern
Oh,
hemisphere. Like just look at different sides of the sky, which is the reason I'm pointing that out is it's mind blowing to think that like I knew the stars that I knew and constellations, and I remember my dad would show us all this stuff when we were kids. And then you go to the other side of the world, like the southern hemisphere, and you're like, wait, I can't find any of the constellations I looked at in the northern hemisphere because there's a whole nother set of them down here. It's a whole nother batch, and it shows you how vast the universe really is. And that's that eternal power stuff, I think, or at least as a signal to that eternal power stuff. But then also, like you said, I can look inside of myself and not just my anatomical composition, but my moral composition that exists. And I may got it, I've got it all mixed up and messed up, but it shows me, okay, where did that come from? Like, I'm not just an animal. I'm not just out here doing whatever I want. I have some sense that there's a right and a wrong. That should tell me that came from something or someone somewhere. That thing came to me.
and the way he begins sort of the list of the moral failures here in verse 21 is even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. It's interesting to me that that's the start of it all,
Hmm.
is that somebody can look at the creation around them, literally breathe the air that God gave them to breathe, eat the food God gave them to eat. Like the planet that he put them on sustains them. The rain falls on the just and on the unjust. They can live in a body that moves them around and thinks and heals itself when it gets hurt. You know what I mean? Like people can do that and literally have no honor at all for the one that gave it to them, for the one that made them. No gratitude at all for like all of this that they just enjoy and have. That's the start of it. I mean, the moment we stop being grateful and wonder at like what it is we have and thankful to the God that gave it, that's the day that things begin to slide.
Yeah.
Like it's such an important start.
Yeah. Well, and that little line has meant a lot to me in two ways. One, uh, in prayer.
Mm,
It really makes you think a lot about like if you're someone seeking God, probably at ground zero for seeking God and ground zero for your prayer life is honoring Him, like praising Him, figuring out how to talk about the things about God that are great and amazing, and giving thanks. Like I can spend a lot of time making a bunch of requests or complaining about a bunch of stuff that I don't like the way it is. But am I returning thanks? Am I actually prioritizing that in my prayers? So if I don't, then probably all my other approaches to God and all the rest of my prayers are going to be kind of skewed and messed up because apparently that's kind of the path away from God is whenever you forget about honoring Him, you forget about giving thanks. That's when you get all messed up. And I mean, like I'm barely even like keeping my head above water, like practicing, trying to learn to be a parent. But I think about this a lot with my kids, that even with us, like one of the like things we're trying to, at least when they're really small and like as they grow, hopefully they'll just kind of grab a hold of this, but practicing like honoring those who are, ahead of them and being thankful, like, and whatever, just practice with us because when you get big, you're not going to need to honor me or give thanks to me, but you do need to have that in your head that your life isn't just something that you should just take and not ever be appreciative for or not honor those. Because really, if you have that attitude, that's sort of, I mean, this is a word gets thrown around sort of as a pejorative phrase, maybe a little too quickly, but entitled or entitlement, that
yeah.
spirit, that attitude, he's talking about that in the ultimate sense here, human entitlement and feeling like, we just kind of deserve this. And we're probably at the top of the heap, actually. And you forget about who gave it to you and who deserves your honor, who deserves your gratitude.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Which is why the next step in this is they become the focus. Like we're entitled, we're wise, we're important, we're going to worship the creation rather than the creator. Like we're going to be the central focus. So whatever passion I want to have, I fulfill it. Whatever desire I have, I go after it. Because I'm the central focus of this. And I don't want to say too much about this, but like, man, we have such a culture of complaining. We just do. And you've been a little bit removed by being in a different country. I mean, I'm not sure what the culture is like where you are, but man, Americans are so whiny and like we complain so much and it makes no sense. Like honestly, it like when I visited India just recently, I didn't hear very many people complaining, like a little bit about some things, but like I come home and we're living in like an amazing place with like all these things, and we cannot stop talking about all the things that we hate about our world and our politics and our leaders and our
Yeah.
and man, it's just such a spirit that gets a hold of people and it's dangerous.
And I don't know. I wonder if some of that comes from we forget about passages like this. In
Yes.
other words, like we get captivated with this idea, like, hey, the world actually should be perfect and the world should be good. And like everybody should behave properly and everybody should be righteous. And look, I'm looking forward to the new heavens and new earth where righteousness dwells and all tears are wiped away and there's nothing evil and blah, blah. I'm really looking forward to that. But that's not where we are right now. And so, like, there's room for critiques, there's room for, lamenting legitimate evils in the world and all that stuff. But if I'm just walking around complaining all the time, then I'll probably miss like, where do you think we are? Like, where do you think we are right now? That is what we're living in. And it's unfortunate. And like, we got to figure out some way to try to ourselves stay anchored in gratitude and honor toward God and try to bring others to the glory of God. Because, like all of us, we've gone to the glory of these other things and we've totally messed up our lives. But our job is to try to bring people to the restoration of the gospel because that's the reality of where we are.
Yeah. No, that's good. Well said. You know that repeated phrase in here in verse 24, God gave them over. Verse 26, God gave them over. Verse 28, God gave them over.
Mhm.
I guess my question is that unkind of God? Or also, like, what does it mean? What does it mean that he gave them over? Like, how does God give somebody over? Um, I don't know all the answers to this, but it's something I wonder about. And then I might even say, like, have any of us ever been in a place where we had people in our life, that we loved who just weren't going to have it? Like they didn't want to be a part of the family anymore. Maybe kids that were like, I'm not going to be grateful for my home, for my parents, for what I've got in this life. I'm going to rebel against the rules. I'm going to like focus on myself. I'm going to like go off and sort of just do what I want to do in my life. And at some point, as hard as a parent tries to like hold on and try to get their attention and try to like help them, does there come a day where they say like, well, I kind of got to give them over to what they want here, and I hope they won't go too far. I hope they'll come back. But then there's like the next level of things, and you're like, okay, I've sort of been wrestling with them on this for a while. I got to give them over to it again and just see if that gets their attention. I don't know. You have thoughts about like what this God giving them over is about?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if this is totally hitting the point, but I think this is almost a necessary product of God's love. If God loves us and if He made us like Him to love and to be loved, then He can't force anything on us.
Right.
It's not really possible. And so this God giving them up is just saying, like, hey, we all said, God, this is what we want. We actually don't want your deal. We want to do this other deal. And if he didn't give us over, then it would kind of go contrary to his nature or prove that he's actually not a God of love, that he's an oppressive, abusive, enslaving God. No, I'm going to chain you up to righteousness and I'm not going to let you. But fundamentally, like everything else that flows out of God comes out of his fundamental nature of love. And so part of that means he has to allow us to be able to choose whatever we want. Otherwise, like I said, I mean, he would have us chained up in the basement of his righteousness, which is not love. It's not a relationship. It's not anything wholesome as far as we can, perceive it or understand it because we've been made to be like God and in his love. And so that's kind of how I read that, is that it's a really tragic, heartbreaking aspect of divine existence. God and us sharing in that, is that us making that choice and God leaving us to the choice.
Yeah. No, that's good. And it's kind of surprising that verse 24 doesn't just say, therefore God destroyed them. And that
Exactly.
was it. You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
God could have destroyed them at any point in this thing. And honestly, a lot of us, if we had been in God's position, might have. Can't believe they've dishonored me. Can't believe that they've turned their back on me. I can't believe, you know, people go after and try to destroy other people for a lot lesser things.
Yes.
Um, but I don't know. In this wrath that's being revealed, I see God's patience in it, and I see his education in it.
Mhm.
And I think Paul's going to bear that out over the next couple of chapters, that God desperately wants people in this situation to hear the good news, hear the gospel, respond to it, because it's his power to save them. But sometimes the only way he can get them to see the good news is for them to experience the bad news.
Yep. Well, I mean, even in verse 18, like what are we doing? We're suppressing the reality of things with our
Mm.
unrighteousness. Well, when God gives us over to the wrath of that existence of unrighteousness, it's kind of the only thing that can, like, we buried the reality of things. Oh no, it's okay. I can live in all these kinds of ways. We try to bury it, and God's saying, "No, I'm going to dig all that stuff up. So you're going to know. Like you can't run away or deny the reality of things, the truth. And that's why I'm going to give you up to these choices you made so that you can kind of see it for what it is."
Yeah, very good. Well, in the list of all of the failures or sins or whatever, I think there are some that people think of as worse than others. And then there's some, like you said earlier, there's some things on the list that's like, wow, that's in the list. And I've certainly done that. Maybe I've not done some of the other things. But I think I will offer this, maybe just for what it's worth. More and more I hear people that claim to be Christians coming to passages like this, trying to make these things say something different than they say. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to try to, that doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. The people that are practicing things that sound like what that says there about exchanging the natural function, it doesn't really mean that. It means something else. If you find people trying to be apologetic or like make an argument that these sins aren't really sins, like just like notice that they don't do it with some of the other things in the text. You know what I mean? It's only the ones that they want to make sure aren't on the list,
Yeah,
because they're not going to do that with some of the things toward the end of the chapter.
right.
Oh, that means what it means. That means what it means. But this particular one in the middle, it doesn't mean what you think it means. Yeah, just be careful about that.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. One thing that's interesting about this list and this like you said, the three-time phrase, God gave them up, God gave them over, God gave them up. Um, I'm not sure which of these. I know how I've kind of read this list for a while, and it was a few years back. Somebody kind of put me onto an idea that maybe I was thinking about not quite right, but the way I've always thought was like, hey, He says the same phrase for all three groups. So people who are just following their passions, whatever their passions may be, those people, that's sinful, that's wrong. The wrath of God is revealed. Also, the people who are engaging in unnatural passions, specifically here he mentions homosexual relations, right? God gave them up, right? And then there's this third one, the depraved mind, and then he has this list of all these things. And the point being, like, hey, it's all the same. So don't elevate one of these above the rest. Like these are all sins. They're all ways in which the wrath of God is being revealed against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of men. But I actually wonder if, and I'm cool with that. I do, like, all sins are the same. But I actually do wonder if this passage is kind of charting just the downward trajectory that happens whenever you
Oh,
start
sure.
engaging in sin. Like
Yeah.
first, you're just following your passions, whatever that he mentioned sexual passions in the first two stages of this. But really just think about any kind of passion. You just follow a natural inclination, whatever passion, you just follow that. Well, eventually that passion is going to not be good enough, and you have to kind of level up to the next degree of whatever it may be, and something that's and God gives you up to that. So then you kind of go into that next level. But then I think the wild part is if the third one, verse 28, is sort of like level three, like the worst version, a depraved mind. What he says about that is you're just doing things that are not proper and you're filled with, and then he lists all these things that actually I wouldn't think are the worst, but if it's right to see it as kind of like a stair step down, just general passions, unnatural passions, and then a depraved mind, that's when you kind of lose all sense of right, wrong. I mean, I think I can't remember what translation it says. Instead of unmerciful, I think is what mine said. It would say like without natural affection, where you don't care about people at all. You're not kind, you're not gracious, you can't. And I think
Yeah.
one chapter of the Bible that illustrates this is, or a couple chapters, is Judges chapters 19 through 21. If you go read those chapters, you see just passion. This guy who's kind of got this woman, he's just using her however he wants, as his concubine, all this kind of deal. And she's running away from him and all this kind of deal. Then there's the next level. These, we're gonna, sexually abuse this man and just horrifying. But and then you read it. I don't even want to say it out loud, the stuff that happens, because the rest of the chapter describes what happens when you have a depraved mind where you lose all sense of goodness, really, about how you treat other human beings, about how you behave in relation to God and in the world and all that. It's just a really cautionary tale about don't start on that path because it's never going to end at one place. It's going to keep on going down and down and down to where you eventually lose yourself completely and lose all your morality and goodness.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. When people say things like, all sins are the same, I think it's important that what we say is, yes, from the standpoint of every sin does the same thing to the sinner.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like any sin separates me from God. Therefore, all sins are the same. But this text even says there are some sins that are unnatural, like
Mhm.
they're different
Right.
than sins because they're unnatural. And I agree with you that there is something going downward because when you get to, I think the word that I was thinking of in verse 31 is unloving because it's unloving and unmerciful. I think
Mhm.
you're
Yeah,
saying
yeah.
unfeeling,
Unfeeling. Yeah.
but like in the Greek words for love, there's that word, I think it's storge, like familial love or like natural love. And the only time it appears in scripture is in the negative. It's like a
Mhm.
story or something like that. I may be wrong about this.
Yeah.
But we've got other words for love like agape and phileo and I mean there's eros, but that's not in the New Testament. But this like natural affection like that a mother would have for a child or that people would just have for each other in this sort of natural familial way, he puts in the list, people are going to get to the point where they actually don't have it.
Yeah.
I mean, the Old Testament asks questions like, can a mother abandon her child? Like, can that happen? And that God would say that when he was trying to explain his love for his people, like natural love is just natural love. But look around in our society, and literally there are people who have no natural affection for a life that maybe even is growing inside them.
Mhm.
Like how do we get here? How did this happen? You take this into a different place in a different time in a different culture, and people will be like, it's like that,
Right.
you know? Well, yeah, because that's the slide, that's where it goes.
Yep.
That as short as that little verse is, they are without understanding, they are untrustworthy, they are unloving, they are unmerciful. Those are big words with huge consequence if you really think about them.
100%. I've got the Net Bible pulled up over here, and in verse 31, senseless, covenant breakers, heartless, ruthless. And like that's a great, like those are great words too. Just and back to what we were saying earlier, you look around the world and you're like, ooh, and it kind of feels that way a lot. I mean, it is that way. Like you see things happen, or you try to avoid videos of or stories of things. It's like that's heartless. Like you just don't have a heart in XYZ thing, whatever it is, in a family or in politics or whatever the thing is. And he's kind of saying, like, this is why, guys. You've turned away from God. You've said God's glory isn't good enough. I want something different. And then, because of it, to kind of deal with your life, you pursued your passions, and that wasn't good enough. And so God gave you over to the next level, which is and that wasn't good enough. And so God gave you over this depraved mind, and now you can't even see goodness. You don't even know what it is anymore. And God help us, because that's a really, really dangerous slide we can get in. We've all gotten into, and That's what the gospel is trying to bring us back out of.
And from a communal standpoint or a national standpoint or whatever, even like in a church or in a family, as soon as you see people who are heartless, unmerciful, when you see it and it shocks you, it's really hard to not become that
Yeah.
toward people like that. Like that's what I kind of see happening in our country a little bit. It's like they're heartless, they're unmerciful, and the response to it becomes very similar. You know what I mean? And it just eats people alive. Like it's just Paul warned about biting and devouring each other and being just consumed. Jesus said one time when he was talking about, I believe, the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24, he said, because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold,
Yep.
but he who endures to the end will be saved. And for me, like in a text like this, when I look around and I'm like, man, look at how bad things are getting. The thing I have to keep thinking is I cannot let it become who I am. Even towards the heartless and the unmerciful. I need to be like Paul, who was like, I'm eager to preach to people like this. I'm eager to do this because God loves them. I love them. I mean, I want to, if Paul could come to Rome and go sit in front of Caesar, I think he would have wanted to. You know what I mean? Not to tell him off and tell him how terrible he was, but to tell him that the Lord loved him and that he could be saved from all of this.
And by the way, we know you're right about that theory because go read Acts 24, 25, and 26. Those speeches Paul was giving to dudes that were just like little baby Caesars, basically,
Yes.
and horrible. And that's what he does. He's like, honestly, I would love, other than me being chained up, I'd love for you to be saved. That'd be amazing. And that was kind of what it's all about. Which, circling it back, what he's going to do in a lot of this book is try to help us see, okay, this is the unrighteousness, right? It's following your passions. It's doing things that go against the way you were made. It's things of just a depraved mind. But the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel of Christ. And what that means is Christ, he didn't follow his passions. He actually went against his passions to sacrifice himself in love for us. Romans chapter 5. He did, the thing that God promised, he was faithful. Like we're not being faithful with our bodies whenever we use them in an unnatural way against the way God made them. Jesus Christ was faithful to the end. Um, it wasn't from a depraved mind, but he had a mind led by the Spirit, not by the flesh. And so
Right.
all this stuff is here's how like I'm not gonna fight fire with fire, like you just said. I'm kind of doing a whole different thing. I'm trying to make people know about the righteousness of God through the gospel. And by the way, in verse 32, the danger is people approve this stuff, and whether it's we actually agree with the person or like you said, we approve of the fundamental inner thing. Like I agree with their attitude of selfishness or greed or whatever, or anger and hatred. I'm doing the same thing they're doing. I'm basically approving of what the fundamental problem is, and I'm
Right.
practicing it. And Paul's saying, really, what I want is for people to know the gospel and to practice that kind of life, because that's where God's righteousness really comes into play.
Right. And for all of us that look at it and begin to sort of stand on like, I'm so glad I'm not like that, like the two prayers that Jesus talked about, like,
Yeah.
God, thank you, I'm not like everybody else. The next thing Paul's going to do in this argument in chapter 2, verse 1 is he's going to say, like, hey, I know you just all amend what I said, but you're without excuse too.
Yep.
Just like they're without excuse in verse 20, you're without excuse in chapter 2, verse 1. And then it begins to really the next chapter is going to be pretty hard on us righteous people or the ones that those of us that think we're righteous. And that's where Paul's headed. So it's brilliant how he unpacks this and unfolds his argument.
Amen. It's good stuff.
I have no idea how long we've gone, but we should probably
It's
put
over.
a pin in.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks, man. And thanks everybody for joining us in these. It's fun to read the comments and just hear how what you're learning or what you're seeing that we didn't see. And so thanks for, kind of being along the ride with us. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. I kind of miss them being live, but that also is sort of distracting. We were always like, what'd they say? What'd they say?
Yeah,
Uh,
I know. All right. We love you guys. We'll
everybody,
catch you next
love
time.
you all.